Blast off.
Hello.
Hello, good evening. And we're live. On behalf of Romans, I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual presentation of Fight of the Century. Writers reflect on 100 years of landmark ACLU cases. We're so excited to have Ayelet Waldman, Michael Chabon, Arulanantham and Morgan Parker here with us tonight. Before I properly introduce our guests, some quick announcements. Our event includes an audience Q&A, and to submit a question, just use the Ask a Question button at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like for our speakers to answer, and it will make its way to the top of the list. And if you're interested in supporting our bookstore by purchasing a copy of Fight of the Century tonight, just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen. And with that out of the way, let me introduce our speakers. Ayelet Waldman is the best-selling author of A Really Good Day and several novels, including Love and Treasure, Red Hook Road, and Daughter's Keeper. She is also the writer of the essay collection Bad Mother, A Chronicle of Maternal Crimes, Minor Calamities, and Occasional Moments of Grace. And she also wrote and executive produced Unbelievable on Netflix. Michael Chabon is a best-selling author, essayist, short story writer, and screenwriter. He has written several critically acclaimed novels, including The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and The Yiddish Policeman's Union, which won a Hugo and Nebula Award. His novel Moonglow was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award, and he's also a writer and producer for Star Trek Picard. Next, we have Arulanantham, who is a MacArthur Fellow and a senior counsel at the ACLU of Southern California. He joined ACLU SoCal in 2004, and during his tenure, he has successfully litigated several landmark cases, including the Rodriguez versus Robbins, which required the government to provide bond hearings to thousands of immigration detainees, and Franco versus Holder, the first case to establish a right to appointed legal representation for any group of immigrants facing deportation. And last but not least, we have poet, essayist, and novelist Morgan Parker. She's the author of the young adult novel Who Put This Song On, and poetry collections Other People's Comfort Keeps Me Up at Night. And There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce, and Magical Negro, which won the 2019 National Books Critics Circle Award. And she's also the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellowship and a winner of a Pushcart Prize. So with that said, I'm going to turn over the talk to our guests.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And we'll see if we can get through this without too many bells and whistles from all scenes. That was mine.
Let me see. Make sure mine's muted.
I thought that was somehow me. I don't know.
I'll get credit for that one. So let me start with a question to Ayelet. And this is an amazing collection of essays. And I'm sure a lot of the viewers wouldn't be familiar with it yet. They're tuning in to hear about it. So tell us, what's the concept behind the book? How did you get involved in it? And what was the process of making it? Tell us about that.
So like many of us, I was frantic, panicked, disgusted, depressed, suicidal after the election in 2016. And I called up a friend of mine who's at the ACLU. His name is James Essex, who's at the Gay and Lesbian Rights Project. And we went to law school together. And I said, James, if you could use the services of two novelists in your fight against this hellacious new regime, we're there for you with whatever you need. And you know, the one spot of reassurance we had was that you guys put out on social media within hours of Trump's being elected this line that said, "Trump, see you in court." It was just, we felt so real. I mean, we just felt like there was going to be a thin red line between us and the worst of the Trump administration, or at least someone to fight against it, whether or not we could win. So James said, funny you should say that, but it's our centennial is going to be coming up in 2020. And we would love to have you guys do a kind of book like you did for for Palestine. That we did this book called Kingdom of Olives and Ash, which was a collection of essays by different writers. We brought them to Palestine, and we just said, write what you want.
Wow.
We're not no expectations, no sort of political agenda. Just write what you see, write what inspires you. And it was a really great book about what occupation means on a personal level to individuals living under an occupation. So as soon as James said that, I said, that's a fantastic idea. And I think I know how we do this. We get a bunch of novelists, essayists, and we have them each take a case, one of the seminal ACLU cases, and then they riff on it. They write whatever they want. They write an essay, they write a short story, they write whatever they're inspired, what inspires them. And then we took that out to market. Simon & Schuster stepped up with a huge advance, which all of the money went to the ACLU. Nobody got paid here. We didn't make a dime. Morgan didn't make a dime. Nobody got paid. But also all the whole advance and all the royalties are going to the ACLU. And I will say, sorry, Morgan, the one thing Simon & Schuster said was no poetry.
I know.
No
It doesn't sell.
It doesn't sell, exactly. So
even though there are a lot of rhymes for Miranda, you could have probably done a good
Oh man.
Just I apologize.
Truly there could be you can do a separate protest poems anthology for
yes,
this.
Exactly. Let's do that.
There's an idea there. I think there's an idea there. Maybe that's an interesting idea.
Next. Oh, so then we just sat down and we were like, who are our favorite writers? Who are the writers who are meaningful in contemporary society? Who are the writers who we want to hear from about this issue? And we assembled this list, and there are 41 people, and it's everyone from Morgan to Marlon James to Jackie Woodson to Salman Rushdie to Anne Patchett. It's an incredible list. And one of the things that Jessamine Ward, I mean, guys,
Viet Nguyen.
Yeah.
And the thing that's so exciting to us, people keep saying, oh, it has so much diversity. I'm like, no, it has quality. I mean, these are the best writers in the country. That's what we were looking for. And if you are trying to put together a volume with the best writers in the country, you will have diversity because the best writers in the country come from all over. And you know, every time you pick up an anthology that's all white writers, you're like, well, you weren't looking very, you know, more your criteria. So
you have to go out of the way to do that. Almost.
Yeah, you have to work really hard. Push aside, you know, all these writers. Like, yeah, no, I'm not gonna ask Jessamine Ward. I'm not gonna ask Morgan Parker. Anyway, whatever. So we did that. We got everybody was so excited to participate.
It was a lot easier to recruit people to this one than it had been to the Israel-Palestine one. I'm just gonna say.
They could do it while being in place, right? You didn't have to go to Palestine to do it.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
We even flew people business class to Palestine. We're like, okay, we're gonna sweeten this deal.
But they were like, I am not touching.
Yeah.
But this one.
Yeah, everyone was stoked. And then we sent around this, we asked the ACLU, ask your colleagues to come up with a list of what they thought were the most important ACLU cases. Yeah. And we just sent that list around. And we said, pick a case that you connect with on some level. And people did. They swept it out. Some of the cases, there were, you know, people had really personal, deep connections to.
Yeah, sometimes the writer knew right instantly which case they were interested in.
Yeah, I mean, you know, just thinking
like Sasha Heyman.
Alexander Heyman knew he's in a relationship. His marriage is a mixed marriage. He's married to a Black woman, and so he knew he wanted to write about loving and what that what it means to be living in that kind of marriage in the context of American, you know, a white supremacist society, and what it means having the legacy of loving. How meaningful that is to him and to his family. So that was really cool.
And other writers really needed this list to go through it and sometimes to have the case sort of to be talked through it and have all the sort of ramifications sort of explained to them, and then they seized on it, right? You know, right.
And like George Saunders, for example, he really wanted to dig into this more esoteric, sort of more legally interesting case, and because he wanted to learn something. So he actually worked very closely with the ACLU, with a bunch of lawyers there to really kind of get into the nitty gritty on this case, and wrote a typically beautiful, beautiful George Saunders essay about it. So, so people came, you know, there was all sorts of different ways that people approached it. And it was a wonderful, I will say that 41 writers, kind of herding them, getting them to hand their stuff in on time, getting them to like, you know, I'd be like, you have 3 days to do your edits. You don't edit in 3 days. That's it. It's being printed. So
Right.
there was a lot of me sending out these like cajoling / haranguing emails. Being
like after that, now you could like,
and as
you
always,
at this point, you know, after having done that.
The worst, most like the people who were the hardest to make
I was
stick
one of the last.
to the yeah.
But it's always the people who are journalists who have or started in journalism or have experience as journalists. They're early.
Yeah,
Right.
they just
Or
had
they're
it
right
in.
on time, and then it's always the fiction writers that have to be really
Novelists, man.
I'll never forget Salmon CCing everyone saying, sorry, I'm going to be late.
Yeah,
Like, that's
some
nice.
public shaming.
Dude, I swear to God, I think he wrote it on a phone.
But that one's really good, actually.
Yeah, it is.
Actually, you know,
Roosty, he can pull it off.
Yeah.
He can write it on Twitter and it would be fine.
right. So let me bring Morgan in because yours is, I haven't read them all, but I've read a bunch of them. Yours is as powerful and personal, I feel like, as any of the ones that I've read. It's a remarkable essay, really moving essay. And you chose to write about this case, Bob Jones, which I would guess that most of our viewers here probably don't even know what that is. You know, as a lawyer, you know, that if I was to ask, like, what's the holding of Bob Jones or what's the legal stand, I would say, you know, it's that the government's interest in eradicating race discrimination kind of overrides this person's religious interest in, you know, forbidding interracial dating.
Mm-hmm.
So that the IRS, and what it is it's a university that wants to keep its tax exempt status, and the IRS says, we're going to pull your tax exempt status because you are now banning interracial dating. And this is in the 80s, right?
I was going to say, tell them the year.
Right, yeah, 1983, right? But your essay is just incredibly powerful and sort of personal. Tell us about it. Why did you pick this case? You know, why did you choose to write about it? How it speaks to you? Tell us about that.
So I grew up going to Christian schools and non-denominational, but they were very kind of fundamental or evangelical Christian schools. And so I had a lot of experience with just Christian education in general and what that entails in terms of being outside of the law, even, you know what I mean? And also, on the other hand, have an experience of having sex with white men. So I thought, you know, who better? And I couldn't think of anything. Like,
that's why we came to it.
Yeah, I thought, who better?
Yeah, I'm like, this feels like very my alley.
Right.
Whether or not I want to talk about this stuff, I must. Which led to me finding this big Is Segregation's scriptural sermon that the founder wrote. And that's when I kind of was like, oh, okay, this is a whole other thing, perhaps. There's a lot more to say.
So tell us about that sermon, because you can't, if you read the case, it's not like the case includes some description.
Yes.
And from your essay, I did not go look at the sermon. But from your essay, it's incredibly disturbing. But you tell the story in this kind of incredible way. Tell us about that sermon that he's getting. This is Bob Jones's sermon, right?
So this is the founder of Bob Jones University. He wasn't president at the time of the ACLU case. That was his son, dutifully, you know, following through. But he was kind of like the head of the whole Bob Jones empire, which was this university, and I think also an elementary school. If not, they did that one later. And he was just kind of this big, prominent Billy Graham type preacher in South Carolina. And he was a desegregationalist or segregationalist preacher. And but he also was this kind of I don't know, boisterous and spreading the word and the Bible and all of this. And, you know, there was such a concern in civil rights time with white Christian churches and how they were contributing or not, and where they stood on these issues. And you know, we see this today, people grappling with religion versus like their basically civic duties. And so I was really interested in his sermon that was like supposedly rooted in scripture, justifying, I don't know, anti-miscegenation, I guess, and also just this idea of separateness. And that's kind of where I was so interested in just like interrogating that and debunking it and kind of going at him in this debate way, because like factually and like analytically, it's just not sound anyway. So
yeah. Because I think one impression I get from it is this like kind of brutal tearing to shreds of the argument in the sermon. That's one of the things that you're like, it is one line out of one passage and, you know, in the Bible, and you're like, but just apply this 100 other ways and what you're saying makes no sense, right? But then I also got the sense that you yourself, growing up in these spaces, you know, maybe you, I assume you hadn't like met a Bob Jones type person specifically, but that you felt excluded from all these spaces and marginalized and not kind of part of what these spaces were. I assume people wanted at some level to be that way, but at the same time, they totally were not, right?
And, you know, I think it is more about presenting all of that and presenting the argument, but also presenting the evidence and kind of speaking about how the good intention to follow something, it means nothing. And I think that's kind of at the heart of this case as well. It's, you know, supposedly upholding their beliefs, but really it's just prohibiting progress. And you know, those sorts of ideas don't go away. And I think there's something really dangerous about big proclamations like this that, you know, if he wants to specifically apply it to this thing, that's fine. But that ideology follows through. And that's something that should not be political, you know, that is like, that should not be influencing the average citizen and how we think of each other in particular.
Right. It's an interesting sort of footnote to this that I found recently. Bob Jones cited, like in one of these very most recent, I think it might be like literally, it's the last day of cases or second last day of cases. It's cited in Our Lady of Guadalupe School in the dissent. So that's the case which held that religious teachers teaching in religious schools are totally outside the coverage of all the employment discrimination laws. So you got two teachers actually, one who says that they're fired because of their age, and another one who says they're fired because, I mean, basically because they got sick. And so the is that it's, you know, either retaliation or they're just trying to cut costs. And so they fire the person in violation of the ADA and the American with Disabilities Act. And the other one is age discrimination. And the court holds, no, we just say categorically, if you're teaching a religion, then it's a court-made doctrine. The ministerial exception applies. And because of the need to keep the courts out of figuring out, of looking into the employment decisions, it used to be of just ministers. You know, originally, if a minister got fired, that minister couldn't bring a claim. But now it's extended now with these cases and applies to just people teaching in religious schools. That we're just going to say there's no employment protection for these people. You go to that school, they fire you, the courts are not going to get involved no matter what. And it's the dissent, which cites Bob Jones. And I have to say, I wonder, and you know, as a matter of, if Bob Jones is on the books, I don't think it's going to get overruled, I hope. But it makes you wonder.
He has it again.
Yeah. I wonder, this court today, if they had gotten that case, I wonder if they would have decided the same way. You know, it's really, I'm not sure.
This court,
like worse, you know, I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, unless it's eradicated from, if religion is supposedly apart from the state, then, you know, these things wouldn't be perpetuated, you know, and I think it influences even voters in that way when those things are perpetuated. And people kind of have a false sense of what is really going on, because that's not an education. You know what I mean? Like, you can't,
right.
Like, we don't have teachers at this college. You can't do that, you know, just right now they're ministers, tomorrow they're accredited, you know, chemistry professors. So, and that's the problem really with a church that's also run like a business, that's also run like a school, that's also run like a business, you know, that's also run like a social club that is racist. So,
and like and also a lobbying group.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's all, of course, it's all tied up in money. And I mean, and actually, I should write this down for edits. But what's interesting, additionally, about the Bob Jones case is really the question we should be asking is, you couldn't give up, even for money, even for the tax cuts, you couldn't give up the stringency of, you know, prohibiting not just interracial relationships, but anyone who is known to advocate for interracial relationships of any kind. You know, you couldn't give that ridiculous idea up, even for a tax. I would take anything for a tax cut. So it's like, even that interplay, because it's always, you know, is it capitalism? Is it racism? Is it, you know, religious discrimination? What's going on?
No, it's racism on this one.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So Michael, let me switch over to you for a minute. You wrote about Ulysses. It's the best case name in the book, I think, hands down. Right, United States v. one book called Ulysses. And as I told you when we first got on, I feel like your book is really kind to, your essay is really kind to lawyers. I read this and I'm like, oh, that's so nice. That's so, tell us a little, it's a switching gears, it's a different kind of case, but tell about the story you describe and why you picked that one.
Sure. Well, you know, last time I talked about this, our oldest daughter was watching, and she told me afterwards that she was actually the one who suggested that I do this case. So I don't remember that, but it may well be the case. What I do remember is that I was really casting around looking for what to write about. And, you know, very generously, I had sort of stepped back from the master list and allowed all these other writers to kind of choose the juiciest cases and the cases they interest them the most. But when, let's say, my daughter then suggested this, right away what I thought of and what was the way into this story for me, and I thought from the beginning I was going to probably try to, in a sense, just tell the story of the case, just do a narrative, was the fact that up until about 1986 in the United States, every copy of Ulysses published included Judge Woolsey's ruling allowing it to be imported into the United States right up front. Like, when you open the book title page, before you get to stately plump Buck Mulligan, right there is this 4 or 5 page decision written by Judge Woolsey. And every time it's one of my favorite books, and every time that I've read it, I always start by reading the decision. So I actually knew the decision kind of well, and it's really fun to read. It's really well written. It's really pleasurable. And you get a sense of the guy who wrote it, that he's sort of fancies himself a little bit of a literary man himself. And he makes some little witticisms about like Irish people's sexual mores, and so there's something kind of funny about it.
Celtic and spring, right?
Yes, right. Yeah. It must be remembered that Joyce's population was Celtic and his season was springtime, or something like that. So I thought, I kind of always wondered, like, why? Like, there aren't a lot of books, masterpieces of literature, that start with a court ruling by a judge, right? So, like, why is that there? And so I went in through that, and what it turned out to be was this incredible feat, you know, as you say, this incredible feat of lawyering by a man named Morris Ernst, who at the time I believed, and it says on Wikipedia and it says in other reference works I consulted, was a founding member of the ACLU. Turns out maybe not so much a founding member. That's apparently what he told everyone for his entire life. So like I heard from his biographer who said the reason that you and everyone think he's a founding member of the ACLU is because that's what he told people. But it turns out he wasn't really, but he was an early supporter and he was
an early member, just not
an early member. And he
was I mean, Roger Baldwin is the person we often talk of.
Exactly.
Right.
And he precedes the ACLU actually as a champion of First Amendment rights. And so, you know, his credentials are sound without that. But anyway, what I just discovered was that his whole career was essentially devoted to overturning this huge Victorian edifice of the Comstock laws that had been put in place in the United States in the late 19th century by a man named Anthony Comstock, who was not even an elected or appointed government official when he began his crusade to keep smut out of the United States. And he was highly successful in his campaign. And he was appointed, even though he didn't have any kind of credentials for doing this, as the essentially official postal censor of the United States. He kept all of this stuff out. And Morris Ernst had really decided at some point, you know, this is wrong. America's not a country that does that kind of thing, and we need to do something. And he had been selectively targeting various works, like books that sold themselves as marital aids, like books on how to help couples, you know, learn about sex, essentially. And those things were all banned. So he would try to choose sort of test cases that were less obviously pornography or weren't pornography at all, and yet were being banned for being pornography. He was also a literary man himself, and so he had read Ulysses. At the time this story began, the only way you could get Ulysses legally was in Europe, in France, in Paris, at Shakespeare and Company bookstore. The owner of that bookstore created a publishing house just to publish Ulysses. And if you went to Shakespeare and Company, you could buy it there. Or if you wrote them, they would mail it to you, but they weren't allowed to mail it to the United States. So he set this whole plan in motion. And what I ended up really learning was it was really like kind of like a heist film. You know, he was a mastermind. He recruited the people he needed to do the various aspects of the job. You know, he needed somebody that would go to Shakespeare and Company, buy a copy of the book, put it in his trunk, and get on a ship that was sailing for the U.S. and allow it to be seized by customs, so that then this book itself would become effectively the plaintiff, or rather the defendant in the case. So it's like the U.S. versus one book. It was literally the book was what was, you know, being tried in this case.
And then one of the hilarious things, they don't seize it. They're like, everybody. Yeah. No, and then he has to persuade him to seize it so that he can challenge its seizure, right?
Yeah, this guy who bought the book and brought it in his trunk and like was kind of fearfully going through customs, like waiting for, and they just open it up and they're like, oh yeah, everybody brings this in. They put it right back, shut his trunk, and let him go. And so then he shows up at the offices of Random House, because the other person really behind this was Bennett Cerf, the publisher of Random House. He really wanted to publish Ulysses. He knew he could make a fortune if he published Ulysses. And in fact, Morris Ernst knew that too. Another great thing about Morris Ernst was he negotiated a deal with Bennett Cerf to charge him. He did the whole thing pro bono. He didn't charge him a penny for this, but he cut himself in for a percentage of the book if the book were published. So Bennett Cerf and was waiting, you know, to get a call like, your book's been seized, start this emotion. And instead this guy shows up and says like, here's your book you ordered. And he's like, we didn't want the book. So then Morris Ernst, the lawyer, like takes the book himself, goes back down to the docks and starts grabbing customs officials until he can find one who's willing to seize this book and impound it so that they can start the process of
I just really love the idea. I mean, I've never managed to make it all the way through Ulysses. It's beautiful, but it's an incredibly difficult book to read. And I just love the idea of like the American public at large desperately waiting to read Ulysses en masse.
Because they thought it was dirty. I mean, it had this reputation of being this just filthy book, because people couldn't read it, their imaginations ran away with them, and they just thought it was just.
Which it totally isn't, right? I read it in college, but it's not dirty. It's just incomprehensible, right?
Exactly.
I'm like, why this book of all the books? It's so strange.
I mean, it has some pretty filthy stuff in it here and there, but like the book itself is not. You know, and there are things in this book that you didn't put in a novel at the time, like the one of the two main characters, Leopold Bloom. the first time we meet him, within one chapter, he's taking a crap in the outhouse, and we're like sitting with him while he's doing that, and we're in his mind, and he's just thinking the thoughts that one would think while doing that in 1904 in an outhouse in Dublin. So, but like that hadn't happened in the novel before.
Not yet.
It gave it this air of sort of deeply perverted and forbidden, but what people in this case kept, like the poor postal inspector who had to read it, and then like the assistant prosecutor, and then the prosecutor, and the postmaster, they're all reading this book, and like some of them say, like, I don't know what this is, I can't make head or tail out of it, but I don't think it's pornography. And then others, to their credit, including the postmaster of the U.S. at the time and the judge in the case, would all say, this is not only not pornography, but I'm afraid it's actually a masterpiece. Like it's clearly a great work of literature, and it's we have to let this book into the country. So yeah, it's an amazing story.
Make a great
it is a great story, and I feel like it's also, and the Rushdie essay reminds me of this too. It's like now, like what the government would ban James Joyce is bonkers. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion at the time, right? It's not sort of obvious the way the case would end up.
Routinely, books get banned all the time, right? I mean, local governments ban books, throw them out of the schools. I mean, it's almost a point of pride to be a writer whose books are banned.
Morgan, have you been banned?
Not yet.
God damn it, Morgan.
We write.
I thought it was going to be this year.
It'll happen for you. I know it.
To Ayelet's point, we write demand letters on stuff like that all the time. You're totally right. It still happens in these sort of crazy ways.
But I think it's a good point that you say, you know, James Joyce specifically. You know, I feel in terms of profile, it just doesn't seem like that would be the first book that, you know, folks would have trouble with. It's very funny.
I mean, it's they're just, this myth grew up around it because you couldn't get it, because it was like you had to sneak it in, and people hid it in their luggage, and so it just took on this, like, people imagined the worst. But the fight was far from over, and you know, in the following half century, there were these other big cases with Lady Chatterley's Lover and Lolita, and
that's actually Lady Chatterley's actually.
Yeah, that is dirty. I remember reading that when I was young.
So, you know, it took a series of. I think what's considered like the last important Supreme Court decision, sort of settling this question once and for all, that like local standards apply of what the government doesn't say what's pornography and what's not, was like 1968 or something like that. So
this is what they call obscenity doctrine, right? Like
maybe it was Myra Breckinridge, I can't remember. But anyway, it took this was like the first big blow, and then it took subsequent battle.
So let's talk about Ayelet's essay for a bit. This one I say is very close to my heart. You know, it's a case that probably a lot of people it's not Miranda.
I'm sure people don't know about it.
Yeah, O'Connor v. Donaldson, right? And I'll tell you, there's two ways in which O'Connor has come up in our work a lot.
Oh, I would love to hear that.
Yeah, so one is, and I want you know, definitely to talk about the essay, but I'll just say sort of by way of background, it's a case limiting the power of the government to imprison people. That's the right word that should be used, right? Is imprison people on the basis of their purported mental health, you know, problems. And essentially, I think I would describe it as basically establishing the idea that you have to be a danger to yourself or others. Just that first basic move, right? Then after that, there's what procedure, who determines that. There's a bunch of other stuff that gets built out. But that first idea, we're not going to lock people up unless they are actually dangerous to themselves or others. A lot of my work, and a huge chunk of the ACLU's work, I think could be understood as, how do we stop the government from imprisoning people without trial? In a bunch of contexts. That's what Guantanamo is. That's what the entire immigration detention system is. You know, that's what the jail for you know, because tons of people are locked up before their trial, and then it goes on for ages. Like, there's all these different things, and what they really have in common is we're putting people in prison, but they actually haven't had a trial and all the protections that go with a trial. And O'Connor is a really early and foundational one of those. Right, so that's one reason. The other thing is, And actually, Rira mentioned this in the bio. We did a lot of work on trying to establish that people with serious mental disorders have a right to lawyers when they're facing deportation. Because they also recently, I'm talking about 10 years ago, were getting lost in the gulag of the American immigration prison system without lawyers, and then being locked up for years. Our client Jose Franco, who was you mentioned 4.5 years locked up in an immigration prison system, no active proceedings going. And a lot of that was just about taking OConnor and then now applying it in these other contexts. So I think it's an incredibly important case, an unbelievably important case. First and foremost, obviously, for people with serious mental disorders, but then also for what it has done and the kind of groundwork it's set for other areas of law too. So tell us, you picked this one. You talk a little bit at the end about why.
I will, as long as you promise that we can then get back to the work you're doing, because I'm so interested in hearing, particularly in the context of where we are right now with COVID, what's happening with the crisis of incarceration of people seeking asylum, of immigrants to our country. So I would love to hear more about that. Sure. So I'll talk, but then you have to promise to talk after. Okay. So I chose this case because I have a mood disorder. And like Morgan, like you were saying, the case made me really uncomfortable. And when I first started writing, I remember Michael said to me, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not doing it right. Like, it's not close enough to the bone. If you feel a sense of peril when you're writing, that's a sign that you're on the right track. So this case really made me deeply uncomfortable because I could see myself in this guy, Donaldson. He's a man who's clearly bipolar. Morgan will be back. He's clearly bipolar, and he is put into a mental hospital of the day. You know what those are like. And he is, he's just kept there. He is not treated. There's no treatment. There's no, that you could count on your hand the number of hours he actually spent in the company of a psychiatrist. He's just warehoused. And from the moment he is put in this asylum, he keeps saying, I'm not dangerous. I want out. I can take care of myself. I have people who are willing to help me. I want out of here. And this one doctor who then ended up running the institution just wouldn't have it.
He didn't like him.
Yeah, I think he just really didn't like him. Guy's a pain in the ass. You read his autobiography. He's a serious, he's a conspiracy theorist. He probably was no fun. And he's also pointing out these desperately hideous human rights violations in these places. People crammed into these big wards, things that are conducive to make you even more mentally fragile than you were going in. And he, for years and years and years, he fought to be released. And the lawsuit was ultimately brought by, of course, the name is escaping me now. This is another one of these cases, like so many of these cases, it's about a heroic attorney who devoted his life to representing the mentally ill and trying
the New York
to
Liberty Division, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm blanking on his name now, but it's an ACLU lawyer. Yeah, ACLU did amazing work on this for years.
Amazing work. And his thought, what he really wanted to do is establish an affirmative right to treatment. That if you're going to take someone, you're going to throw them in a hospital, that you actually have to treat them. You can't just warehouse them. The court didn't go that far, unfortunately, but they did establish what we all know is, in California, we call it a 5150, a hold. You can hold someone for a certain number of hours, days, while you try to determine dangerousness, but you can't just warehouse someone forever. And, I've never been dangerous. Well, I don't know. Have I been?
You're always a little dangerous.
But there is definitely a universe in which a woman like me, certainly a woman, would have found herself incarcerated in one of these facilities. And it is for the grace of this attorney and this one man who was willing to, be a pain in the ass and keep demanding his release, that I don't have to confront that if, and that I can even contemplate. I've never gotten there personally, but, I know people who have, and I can imagine a universe in which I felt like I needed to be somewhere for a couple of days just to kind of reset. And that is a possibility, because it wasn't before, because you could do that and then you're done. Then you're locked up forever. So it felt like a really important and personal case for me. And it's also, you know, we live in an area in the Bay Area with a tremendous amount of homeless, mentally ill. And a lot of times the fact that we have a homeless crisis, specifically among the mentally ill, gets blamed on O'Connor versus Donaldson, that they opened the doors of the asylums, they closed them all down, all the psychiatric facilities, and just dumped everybody out in the street. And to a certain extent, that's true, but it's not because of O'Connor versus Donaldson, because that case wanted to establish, like, the idea was that you would treat people in their community, but you treat people. So what's the response of the American government? Oh, well, let's just, and thank you, Ronald Reagan, let's just put them out on the street. No therapy, no support.
Or put them in prison.
Yeah. And so now, of course, we have a system where we do have a horrible system of permanent incarceration for the mentally ill. It's just jails and prisons.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there really is no way to overestimate the depravity of the American judicial system and the way that it manages to figure out the worst possible solution to every crisis.
But it's also, it started to feel this way when we've talked about this case recently. It's also a cautionary tale about what happens when change doesn't go far enough, when reform doesn't get finished.
Right.
You know, like in this era of Black Lives Matter and defund the police, like you can't get part way there and say, okay, well, we took care of this. Now we don't need to change the laws, rewrite the laws, change our institutions, dismantle our institutions that don't work and replace them with ones that will. And that's kind of what happened in the case.
Yeah, we have to go the distance. Like when we're talking defund the police, which I feel like I spent a lot of time explaining to white people what that means. We're talking about, you know, disaggregating police functions. We're talking about all of these things that the police don't have any business doing, that they respond to with violence. But like, you just like, we're not just saying, oh yeah, we don't need to take care of people. We don't need to provide community support. We don't need to provide economic support. We don't need to provide education. We don't need to provide jobs. We don't need to build up the community so that we just, you know, we have to alleviate poverty before we can, or not before, as we dismantle the system that is so oppressive. And that, you know, that's my fear. I think no police is better than police. Honestly, if we only went halfway, it'd be better than what we had right now. But
I don't agree. I don't agree.
I mean, yeah, you know, we just had a home invasion.
Right.
We just had a home invasion where I woke up in the middle of the night and there was a man standing over my bed. Michael was outside in his studio and he like slipped his hand under the covers and I started screaming and my children ran in and saved me basically. But like, I was really glad that I had someone to call. I was glad that I could call 911 and that they caught him and that he's that he's not on the street anymore. Although like trying, you know, whatever, we don't have to talk about that right now, but I'm saying like, we need to go the distance in this notion. Like now that we have an opportunity for criminal justice reform, we have to push it all the way to the end because this is a chance, you know, if we can alleviate the crises of poverty, if we can create a system of support where if you are mentally ill, there is a mental health crisis team that can help you.
Yeah, I think seeing, I mean, in LA, of course, you know, we have unhoused people far more than in San Francisco and far more than any other, I think more than any other city in the whole country, if I remember right. Certainly the density in the quote unquote Skid Row is more than anywhere else. I think seeing the line from the unfinished business of O'Connor v. Donaldson to that's totally spot on, Ayelet. I completely agree with you. And I think that's like, you know, absolutely a really important story to tell. Even in the case I was mentioning in Franco, we wanted to try and win some kind of discharge planning obligation. You know, that immigration, when they're letting people out, has some obligation to figure this out. But you know, the courts, it's like you say, you know, they didn't want to go. They're happy to, and it's a great thing, you know, happy to liberate people, to not imprison them. That much was there, and that's a great thing. But also to provide support for them, to say that the state has an obligation to make sure they get treatment, no way. And that is exactly why, you know, the jails have become that. one of the things we've done actually here locally is, and we've just had a success in it recently because of all this defund momentum and all the work that Black Lives Matter really has done on this, is gotten the government to agree, the LA County to agree to eventually close Men's Central Jail. And a huge chunk, it's the largest jail, apparently some people say it's the largest jail, I think in the Western Hemisphere or something like that. It's definitely the largest jail in the country. And it is entirely a product of various forms of over enforcement and over incarceration, right? Because if you're serving more than 365 days, you're not there, right? It's all and a ton. I don't know what the numbers are. I don't have them at my fingertips, but a huge percentage of in there are people who have mental disorders of some kind or another. I saw a recent statistic actually from just an interesting story. I got to had the privilege of representing Black Lives Matter LA in their curfew challenge. They challenged as part of, they tried to stop the protests as a way of, and that was, one of the best client experiences ever. Professor, Abdullah, who's one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter LA, I learned so much. It's just amazing. But one of the things was that a third of all LA Police Department encounters, like of the times that they deal with people on the, out in the world, a third are people who do not have homes. So it's like a third of their time is spent interacting with, homeless people in Los Angeles. It's just stunning.
So what if we took a third of their budget and we put that into
how do you know that money?
Yeah.
And that's just them walking around. It's not responding to, calls of disturbance. That's just them approaching,
right,
to have an interaction, which might give them an opportunity
tons of,
right in there.
Yeah. You had asked me about our work, involving the staff. So the curfews is one of those actually. It's the same body of law because the curfew, the way it was implemented, was essentially like house arrest. And so it's an argument for the freedom of movement. It's both a First Amendment argument, like, these are incredibly important moments. These people have a right to go, protest in the street. And also that the way it was implemented was like everybody had to be in their house after 6 o'clock, right? So it's literally restricting movement, and that's, but most of our work, and that was, I enjoyed those. Those were super cool cases to do. But the biggest chunk of the ACLU's work as a whole, and mine too, actually, since the pandemic, has been litigation on behalf of people in prisons, jails, and immigration detention centers, just to try to depopulate them. And that was a choice we made mostly because from a just like a really basic, raw kind of how many people can you try to help with the resources that you have kind of thing. We're like, people are going to die in these places. And unfortunately they have. It's been incredibly sad. We've had a lot of success. We've gotten a lot of people out. But I was just looking at these numbers the other day. Since the pandemic, we filed 68 cases around the country against prisons and jails for not depopulating and therefore not permitting social distancing because you can't socially distance in it. And then I think 53 cases against immigration prisons or immigration detention centers.
That's amazing.
Just a huge number, massive, massive effort, including in our office too, all with the goal of trying to protect people because you're just a sitting duck in, and of course the guards are coming in and out. So when you have community spread in a community, like the biggest immigration detention center in Southern California is in a place called Adelanto, which is about 2 hours-ish east of LA. San Bernardino County is a massive community spread outbreak, right? So the guards who are employed in this place, are getting exposed from their families and going to the grocery, just the way it's happening everywhere else. Then they're coming into the immigration detention center. And then the people there are sleeping. You know how prisons are, because the immigrants are held in prisons, even though there's no shouldn't be a legal justification for that. So they're held like 6 people or 8 people to a bunk. Dozens of people sharing showers, dining like super close, and like the pictures you've seen in prisons. But you can't socially distance in a place like that. And so we've had massive outbreaks actually all over both prison systems and immigration detention centers. And that's been a huge chunk of our work, since the pandemic hit. And
we're so grateful to you for doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, it
you.
affirms the commitment that we made with, like, this is why we did this book, because, I mean, part of it for us was just a way to say thank you. It was a way to express our gratitude for the work that you guys have been doing for the past century.
Great.
And
the thing that you see, that what you're doing now, and all the ACLU offices, chapters all over the country, the ACLU has never stopped doing, has always been doing. And the thing that you learn from reading this book, from reading the pieces, which are arranged chronologically, is the fight just never ends. It's always the same fight ultimately. Like, even though the details change and the things that society is, the demons that society has appointed, like, these are the people we're afraid of right now, whether it's communists or black people or whatever it is, like the demonized group, the target group, or the people who are having their rights limited in some way or infringed on, may change over time. It's the Korematsu, it's the Japanese American population, but the issues are always the same, and the fight is just endless. And for every victory, there are many defeats, and even with victory, the next time it comes around, you kind of have to fight the whole fight all over.
You win it again. Yeah, I mean, that's
thank God you're there.
Morgan's, thank you. That's very kind of you. I'd say Morgan's piece, and then having just seen the Bob Jones site, it totally makes the same sense. Like, oh man, like I thought this was like 20 years ago.
It's the same, and it's funny because I'm still working on that essay and editing it. It's just, there's still so much that I keep finding out, and that is when I'm deep into researching the schools that I went to and comparing their text on their website to Bob Jones University. So I'm just like totally traumatized at this point. But and that's what it's about, though, is that that continuedness, that continued fight. And again, to say, like, looking through the chronology of it, each one you can kind of see the future cases that will be needed to fight, where these don't fulfill like all of the things. And even thinking about the word confinement, that's interesting because it should be imprisonment, but there also should be a separate one for confinement. Because now that you say that about the curfew, that is, I guess, I don't know if it's like a language thing, but it still feels, like there are several fights on the same kind of battlefield.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So
should we take a couple?
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we have 2 questions in our box right here, and I think that is like perfect timing because we have about 10 minutes. So if one of you can just open up the box at the very bottom.
All right. I'd love to hear from Michael and Ayelet whether there was an essay that they found particularly surprising or different from what they expected.
Well, I know what I'd say right away is the one essay. There's one essay in the book that holds the ACLU's feet to the fire.
Yeah,
like all of the other pieces, because we are so in awe of and grateful for the work the ACLU does and has done for 100 years, and even when they've been on, the side of like the American Nazi Party in the mid 70s, defending their right to peacefully march through Skokie, Illinois, predominantly Jewish suburb of Chicago, full of Holocaust survivors. Even when that's whose side they were taking, they were doing that in the service of an ideal that we absolutely share. And in fact, it was that case was really kind of taught me and Ayelet, both of us as teenagers, what the ACLU is really all about. That why the fight is so hard. But there's one piece in the book that does it, and that's by Scott Turow, and he is writing about not Buckley. Buckley versus Vallejo. It was the lead-in, or it was the precursor to Citizens United.
Well, eventually,
it was a 1-2 punch, effectively, that got us to the point where there's no limits on the campaign donations made by corporations, and Scott that he right away, he was one of the writers who like instantly knew what case he wanted to write about. He is a lawyer himself, in addition to being a novelist. And I think you went to
and right? I called Anthony Romero and I said, okay, so, and David Cole. So Anthony's the head of the National and David Cole's the legal director. And I said, okay, guys, this essay is going to come in and he's really pissed off at you. And Anthony said, that's awesome. And the head of the Massachusetts ACLU told us that that there's a saying that if you disagree with the ACLU 50% of the time, then you're on the board. And if you then you're a member. And if you disagree 80% of the time, then you're on the board. So, so they loved the idea that there was going to be an essay in it that really was like, fuck you, ACLU. So that was great.
Dissent is such a core notion, and the right to dissent, that to have a whole book about the ACLU and not have anybody dissenting would not have been right. So
it would have betrayed the whole point of the institution.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, interestingly, the SoCal has historically had a different view about campaign finance than the national organization. In general, I don't like to talk about, we're one entity. That's how the public perceives us, and it's how we function to a large extent. I don't like to talk about these sort of differences, but that is one where actually our current executive director, Hector, his predecessor, Ramona Ripston, who was a very important civil rights figure for many years, like 40 years, I think she ran the office. She sort of fundamentally disagreed with their view on that. And a couple other things if you go back, long enough. But I love that essay, actually. And I love the end of it. I love the very end of it. He's like, now we can look empirically and see what's happened in Citizens United, because the court made some predictions. And these were the kinds of predictions that the ACLU had always, made too when defending this. And we can say, you know what? We were wrong, and maybe you should say that. Maybe you should say you were wrong and you didn't get it quite right, and kind of admit it and take a different path. So I'm not holding my breath that anybody will do that. But that was a good one.
So this is a question. There's another question here that I think actually would be great for you to answer, Ahilan. It's, what case from the recent term, the Supreme Court term, do you think will have the longest lasting effects, good or bad?
There's several you could choose from. Certainly several you could choose from there. I think Bostock, which is the case that held that Title VII applies to sexual orientation, is like an earthquake in a way, because it just sort of ends all this debate that had happened all over the kind of lower courts. It means millions of people have job protections they wouldn't have otherwise had. It means in all kinds of parts of the country, red states that were, in California, there's like, other protection that would apply anyway. But in much of the country, that's not the case. Yeah. And so the ability, I often think that like real social change happens. And the role that we often play is laying a groundwork, but all we can do is create the conditions, and then the social movements have to kind of, drive it. So you have a bunch of people who can't come out or can't tell their friends and neighbors that they're gay because they're going to get fired. Then there's really limits on how much social organizing that can happen, right? And I think the same could be said for racial justice, for like a whole bunch of issues, right? Bostock means that there's all these people who can be themselves at work without getting, fired for it. And I think that could drive. So that's a big one. That's a really big one. Another one sort of darker, which I bet nobody on this line probably has heard of and got very little attention in general, is an immigration case that we did and we lost, called Thursigam. And if you look it up, I mean, it's really hard to kind of find any information. It's Department of Homeland Security v. Thursigam, who's a Sri Lankan Tamil guy, actually. So an asylum seeker like me, a Sri Lankan Tamil. And he loses the argument that he has a right for a court to review his asylum claim. And the ruling is 5-4 on that subject, right? And the rulings are all constitutional. They say there's no judicial review guaranteed by the Constitution to protect deportation cases, which is itself a reversal of 100 years of law. Actually, it's law going back to the,
to the. Oh my God.
And then they say, the other thing they say is that people stopped both at the border and just even inside the border. He stopped just after he enters. they had no due process rights to challenge anything involving their deportation. That's what it says. It's the holding of the case. No due process protection. Stunning ruling. It got very little attention. I think because DACA happened, and DACA is this incredible victory for this whole segment of the immigration population. But the DACA ruling was just that the administration screwed up the way that they terminated the program. So it doesn't. I mean, it's incredibly important. I don't want to underestimate its importance, but
it could they'll just do it better.
Exactly. It could be reversed tomorrow if they write a memo the right way. This case guts a huge amount of constitutional law involving immigrants.
Wow.
And it's an interesting thing, people have to summarize the Supreme Court term. You see this all the time. They're like, oh, Chief Justice Roberts, he's a minimalist. He doesn't overrule Roe v. Wade. Bostock and Justice Gorsuch writing this thing. And it's true. Some of these opinions are fantastic, but this one involving the rights of immigrants is terrifying. It's terrifying, and it also gives the legal power, the kind of constitutional floor for the Trump administration to go out into the street. Now they've asserted that anybody who cannot prove that they have been here for 2 years, for longer than 2 years, can be summarily deported without a hearing in front of a judge. And that's the maximum statutory power that the government had to summarily deport people. They've now exerted that. People say, well, that means that any non-citizen can be deported. I'm like, no. I have to prove too, right? Any person, unless you prove, what does it mean in practice, right? You can't, because you don't get to go to court. You don't get to go in front of the judge, right? So that, obviously there's a lot of things. The pandemic limits how much immigration enforcement the government can do right now, because nobody can do anything. But in a world where, some of these constraints are lifted and in the hands of the right government, there's a huge amount of damage that could be done by that case. So I feel like it's one of these.
I feel like there's any
in 10 years, a lot of people will be talking about it.
Can't you
say? Do you feel like there's any
Dred Scott? I feel like we need to go all the way back there.
Yeah, I actually think that
people.
Yeah, I think that I just put the name of it in the chat for. I think that the idea, the originalists should say that the Due Process Clause protects persons. There's no person shall be deprived of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law, right? But in the 1890s, you get these racist cases about the Chinese Exclusion Acts that basically say, in effect, that if you are not within the territory of the United States, then you're not protected. And then they say, if you come to the border, we're going to treat you as though you're not yet within the territory. And so you get this crazy judge-made doctrine, which is totally contrary to the text of the Fifth Amendment. But that's kind of what happened. I do think it does actually implicate Dred Scott to some extent. There's a line. I had a Supreme Court case a few years ago called Jennings v. Rodriguez, which didn't reach this question, but it was in the background. It was about how long can you lock up immigrants, right? And Justice Breyer's dissent. Justice Breyer says the majority of the Supreme Court said, we're going to let the lower courts decide that, and they send the case back. I spent about 2 years of my life litigating the Supreme Court. At the end of it, they're like, "You send it back. You try again." But Justice Breyer's dissent invokes exactly what you just said, Morgan. He says, "Not since the time of Dred Scott has anyone said that persons who are, persons walking around in this country are not persons and not entitled to protection of the Fifth Amendment." And then that was 2018. And now here we are, today. So that one, that's one I would watch. And
do you think there's enough awareness on the part of politicians in this country to make a legislative remedy to actually pass a law saying that deportees are entitled to judicial review?
Yeah. I think
that's the only option.
All the elections are important, but this election, especially when it comes to the immigration politics, a lot of other things too, but on the immigration politics is so important, because I do think that I hope, it seems the Democratic Party, certainly a wing of the Democratic Party, is in a way better place than they used to be on a load of immigration issues. This is definitely one that I think would get attention in the mix. But what do you need to pass immigration law? You'd have to have a majority in the Congress and the presidency long enough to get through, plus all the other things. Like, if what would I vote? If the first thing, they should do something about the pandemic, that would be my vote. I would vote, legislation before immigration myself, I would say, so So yeah, I think there is, but it's going to take a resounding victory of different forces in November to create the conditions for that.
Well, I think that's a really good note for us to end on, which is that it's all everything depends on November. Please vote. Please make your friends vote. It's, don't let anybody tell you that Biden is the same as Trump. Just get your asses to the polls, please.
Yeah, although I'd also say, whoever it is, but certainly Ms. Biden, you got to hold their feet to the fire, right?
Oh yeah.
President Obama deported more people in 4 years.
At least we can hold it.
Yeah, that's true. But President Obama deported more people in 4 years than President Trump.
Russian propaganda television, but nonetheless.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you, Morgan.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And thank you.
And guys, order books from Vroman.
Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. And again, if you click on the green button directly below the viewer screen, that will take you to our website where you can finish your purchase.
Buy a book.
And of course, to learn more about our future upcoming events, please subscribe to our newsletter or check out our events calendar on our website. We have a lot of wonderful events coming up. Our next event is scheduled for tomorrow, June 16th at 7 p.m. with Representatives Eric Swalwell and Ted Lieu. And with that said, thank you again for supporting our bookstore, and have a good evening, everyone. Stay safe.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.